Good evening, everyone. I'm Gabby Berman, the Communications Officer here at the Zeckelman Holocaust Center. Our audience tonight brings together subscribers of the Detroit News and museum members. I welcome you all to Lessons from History, Hope for Tomorrow, a Courageous Conversation, and I thank you for your support. As part of our partnership with the Detroit News, newspaper subscribers will enjoy free museum admission for up to 4 people now through August 8th. So I hope you will take advantage of the opportunity to visit our new permanent exhibit as well as rotating special exhibits. The mission of the Zeckelman Holocaust Center is to engage, educate, and empower by remembering the Holocaust. Each year we reach more than 100,000 people, from students to teachers to adults from every professional background. Our visitors are inspired to take action against hatred and anti-Semitism, to make the world safer. And this begins with a commitment to civility and respect in dialogue, even in fraught times. May these values point us always in the right direction, safeguarding our relationships, our communities, and our democracy. During tonight's discussion, you will see a QR code on the screen. Please scan the code with your smartphone to submit a question to our panelists. If you prefer pen and paper, we will be happy to bring those to you. Just raise your hand. And our Director of Education, Ruth Bergman, will get to as many of them as possible during the audience Q&A portion of tonight's program. Now it is my honor to introduce to you tonight's moderator, Gary Miles. As the publisher of the Detroit News, Gary is committed to honest, accurate, fair, and compelling reporting. He is a Detroit native who grew up in Midland. He has served in reporting and editing roles in Detroit, in New Jersey, and Washington, D.C., and he joined the Detroit News in the year 2000. He is a force for investigative journalism, and he leads the market in digital reader loyalty, so I expect maybe some of your fans are here tonight. He's also a past president of the Michigan Associated Press Media Editors and serves on the boards of the Rosa L. Parks Scholarship Foundation and the Detroit Economic Club. He and his wife, Dorothy, a physician, have 4 children. Welcome, Gary, and our panelists.
Thank you, Gabi, and we're especially proud as the Detroit News for being a part of this program today at this incredibly important time in our history. At least it feels important every day you're in the newsroom. Every day is important, but it's great to be here, and I want to say that it's especially good to be here with 3 friends, Eli, Stephen, and Nolan. And why don't you introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Rabbi Eli Mayerfeld. I'm the CEO here at the Zeckelman Holocaust Center. Wonderful to be with all of you tonight.
I'm Stephen Henderson. I'm a television and radio host here in the local media market, sometimes writer as well, and co-founder of the Civility Project with my friend Nolan Finley.
And I'm Nolan Finley. I'm the other half of the Civility Project and also editorial page editor of the Detroit News for soon to be 25 years. So thank you all for coming out.
Well, why don't we get right into it? Tell us how the Civility Project got started.
It was a blind date, right?
It really was. So I always explain the Civility Project as an effort. I think it's best understood as an effort by Nolan and I to share with other people what we have figured out over the last 18 years. We met in 2007 when I came home from reporting in Washington to come back to Detroit to be the editorial page editor at the Detroit Free Press, the liberal newspaper in town. He had been the editorial page editor of the Detroit News at that point for about a decade. And it didn't take people long to see the two of us, and see the differences between us and figure, hey, we ought to get them together on stage or on air and see what would happen. So they did, expecting that we would fight, and we did. And we fought a lot, and we learned to fight quite energetically and entertainingly. I think a lot of people expected that that was just going to be the extent of it, that we would dislike each other and that would be entertaining. But the more we were put together in these situations, the more we started to talk to each other when we weren't on stage or on the air. And we started to learn more about each other and found that we had other things in common, things that we shared, things that we were interested in together. And so we kind of became friends and started to do more work together. And if you think about when this is 2007, 2008, it's another time in the country's history, recent history, when things were pretty tense politically. I mean, there was a real divide about the upcoming presidential election and the result of that election in 2008. But if you fast forward from there 8 years to 2016 and think about how much more the country was divided after that election, and then 8 years from then, which is now, are things better or are they worse? Nolan and I started to think a couple of years ago about what was happening in the country, the split that seems to have opened up and doesn't seem to be closing, and contrast that with what was going on between the two of us. I mean, we continue to have serious disagreements about just about anything, literally any subject you raise, we will probably have an argument about it. But we also managed to do other things together. We managed to be friends, and we managed to work together. We actually have a book coming out this spring.
Good plug, Steve. I'm glad.
I got that in
orders
right
available.
there. I always said that if there was one thing that might bring us to blows, it would be trying to write a book together. And it didn't. We got it done, and we're still friends. So we started to think about, well, what are the things that work for us? Right? What are we doing? What are the rules that we observe? What are the customs that we have developed over this 18 years that allow us to have this relationship, but also allow us to have these really energetic, spirited, sometimes bitter disagreements about politics or policy? And that's where the project comes from, is that we really thought about those things and kind of crystallized them into 4 different pillars of our relationship, and we share that with audiences all over the country, in fact, now, about the things we do, and just as importantly, the things we don't do that allow us to have that kind of relationship.
And I would say our mission is very similar, Ellie, to your mission here. We're trying to head off the hate, tamp down the hate in our society, in our country today, in our personal relationships, in our politics. And we draw our inspiration from the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, who, I'll paraphrase, who said, we hate each other because we're afraid of each other. And we're afraid of each other because we don't know each other. And we don't know each other because we don't talk to each other. And so what we're trying to encourage is people to talk to each other across the political divide. And that's not nearly as common as you might think. I mean, people have sort of shallow conversations with people they're not sure they agree with politically, but in terms of meaningful conversations, Pew did a story before the election in 2022 that found 72% of the people are uncomfortable or unwilling to talk with someone about politics if they know that person holds a different view than theirs. We are not going to get anywhere in terms of solving our issues in this country if we don't talk to each other and talk to each other productively, and if we remain suspicious and afraid. So, years ago we started bringing groups of Steve's friends, groups of my friends together. We go to the back room of a local bar, and we called them bourbon nights, and people would throw in a few bucks in a hat, and the only cost of entry was talk to somebody you might not otherwise talk to. Get to know somebody you might have thought was not worthy of getting to know. And I use a sort of anecdote to explain the project. Years ago, I think it's probably about 2013, maybe earlier.
Earlier than that.
So Steve and I were up on Mackinac Island both of us covering the Republican State Policy Convention they have every 2 years up there. And, it's a place Republicans get together, talk about the future elections and the policies and et cetera. And, Steve was probably a lot less comfortable there than I was.
It's super popular.
And so, we get done filing, we file our stories to respective papers, and, end of the day, we decide to walk downtown and have a drink. And so we walked into, one of the bars on Main Street, and we sit down, we're talking, and I get up to use the restroom. I walk across the floor, and these two women, conservative women, I knew them, they ran a website that was 100% about attacking Barack Obama. And so I'm walking across the floor, and they pounce on me, and that really doesn't happen to me that often in bars where, believe it or not. And so they said, "Oh, is that Steve Henderson over there?" And I said, "Yes." He said, you like him?" I said, "Yeah." And they said, "He's your friend?" I said, "Yes, he's my friend." They said, "Oh, he's so awful. We just hate him." And, the vehemence of those words, targeted somebody, I was rather fond of even then, it just hit me. It just struck me, and I asked them, "You hate him?" They said, "Oh, yeah, we hate him." I said, "Do you know him? Have you ever talked to him?" They said, "Oh, we would never talk to him." And I said, I looked over there and I said, "My seat's empty. Go over there and sit down, stand with Steve, and I bet he'll talk with you. I bet, he'll answer your question." And so to their credit, they did. And they stayed, and they stayed. And of course, anybody who's ever, started a conversation with Steve knows it's not going to be a short, you're not getting out of there anywhere. But anyway, they just kept talking, and I could see it was cordial, and I could see they were interacting in a very civil way. And I could also see the ice in my drink melting. And so, it got to the point where I finally just thought, I'm going to get Steve out of here. And so I went over and, led him away. And as we're walking out, I asked these two ladies, I said, "Well, what did you think? How did it go?" And they said, "Oh, he's so wonderful. We just love him." And it just sort of struck me at that moment. Nothing had changed in that hour and a half about Steve or about them. Their viewpoints were the same when they left as when they started. What had changed was they'd taken the time to talk to each other and made an effort to understand each other. And that sort of was the genesis of this project. We felt if we could get people to talk to each other without arguing, start out getting to know each other first, we felt that we could make some progress with these conflicts we're having. And, we start out, reminding people that everybody comes to their opinions in the same way. They take the information, the data available, they run them through the filters of their own personal experiences and values, and they come out with a viewpoint. If it's different than yours, if it's different than mine, doesn't make them evil, doesn't mean they're out to hurt you in some way. It just means they lived a different life. And we encourage people to get to know the experiences and values the other person holds before making a whole lot of assumptions about them.
So tell us how you define civility.
I spent a lot of time talking about what we're not trying to do with this project, right? Because I think there are a lot of efforts to say what we really need to do is kind of drop our opposition to each other and kind of come together and meet in the middle. And that's not what Nolan and I have ever done or seen much value in. I mean, if you've ever seen us or heard us argue, we don't back down, and we don't walk away having said, "Well, he was right after all." I've never said that about him.
You'd have to restart my heart.
That's right. I think what we're trying to do is create a space where people feel comfortable with that opposition, with that difference, with the idea that there are people in the world who just see that world differently, than we do. There's nothing that that Nolan's ever going to say to me or that I'm ever going to say to him that's going to change the way we think about the world and the way that we come to those opinions that we have. Civility is about our ability to maintain a decent relationship with each other and have that conversation, have that argument over and over again. We've been doing this for 18 years now and never walked away from it. The idea is that there's value in the different approaches that we both have and the different ideas that we share with each other, and that each of us gets something out of that exchange. Even if it's not a change of mind, it's an expansion of our understanding or our detail or a wrinkle and a policy thought that we hadn't thought of ourselves. And so I think for us, civility is that. It's the ability to maintain those differences respectfully and without allowing them to damage a relationship between two people, but that gives them the space to have that back and forth. We get after each other when we have arguments, but we don't make it personal. We don't take it personally, and we always come back for more. And maybe we're just gluttons for punishment.
So you can disagree without being disagreeable.
Well-
If you were to boil it now.
No, I
No,
mean,
okay.
No, we are
we're disagreeable as hell, you know that. We
Most
sort of,
people find both of us
yeah,
disagreeable. That helps
but
too.
we sort of reject this notion that agree to disagree, because that means, often means you stop talking and just say, we're going to put this aside, not talk about it, and just let it fester. We want you to disagree if that's your inclination. We say we want you to, it's okay to disagree, but we want you to find value in the disagreement.
Got it.
What can you learn from engaging with someone you disagree with? And, I just think, Steve and I have had countless of these interactions over the last, 18 years. And the value I find in it is, if I'm listening, I always walk away learning something I didn't know before. And when we ask people to set goals for the encounter, it's that. What can you learn from the other person, about the other person, or about the positions that person is advocating for, if you're willing to listen? And there's, I will, as opinion writers, opinion expressors, if you will, commentators, it's good to have that person you can bounce your ideas off and have them challenge you and test your arguments and refine, your points. You don't get as lazy when you're willing to talk to somebody who can push back against you.
So quickly talk about the pillars.
Well, dropping assumptions is one. I mean, we all meet somebody and we hear a little bit of information about them. They're Republican, they're Democrat, they're conservative, liberal, they're Christian, they're Jewish, and we make assumptions about who they are. And oftentimes, if you take the time to actually fill the gaps in your actual knowledge with real information about the person, it changes your perception. And we see this all the time with people who will sit down and say, okay, why do you believe what you do? What makes you a conservative or a liberal? What drives you? What motivates you? What sort of life did you live? They walk away. That knowledge brings a respect that allows a civil encounter and really works against hatred. It's hard to hate somebody who you know that well, even if you don't disagree. And so, dropping assumptions is the first pillar, as we said a minute ago. Don't assume you know everything about a person simply because you know their political viewpoint. The second pillar is setting an honest goal for the conversation, which, I talked about that a little. If you're going in thinking, okay, I'm going to really smash that person, I am going to tear that person apart, humble them with the superiority of my intellect, don't bother. Nobody likes that. And we say a conversation is not a competition. You're not there to win. There's no winning. And once you realize that you're not trying to walk away the victor here, you can step back and learn something from the interaction. I mean, as Steve said, we're never going to convert each other, and we don't try. And so if you confuse a conversation with conversion, you're going to fail. You know, if you go in willing to put yourself on the line and talk about yourself and ask about the other person, leads to a much more productive conversation. We did this ourselves at a certain point.
Yeah, almost 8 years ago, an NPR program called the StoryCorps came to Detroit. And for those who are unfamiliar, StoryCorps is a project that travels the country and kind of collects stories about American relationships. They ride around in a little Winnebago and invite people to come down and bring somebody close to them to have a conversation in this little Winnebago about their relationship, why it matters, how it started, that kind of thing. And I heard they were coming to Detroit in 2017. Most people, when they decide to do StoryCorps, they grab their spouse or they grab a family member and go down there. I immediately said, I'm taking Nolan with me.
And I couldn't have been more disappointed I didn't get there to find out there was no s'mores or campfire. Bait and switch.
So I told him on the way, I said, we're not going there to do what we would normally do, which is get in there and have a fight about something. We are going to go and tell each other our stories. I want you to tell me about all the things that you learned and experienced that have led you to this terribly wrong position in life where you can't get anything right. And I will do the same. I will tell you all of the things that I learned and experienced that led me to be the person that I am. And you know, we'd been friends and working together for 10 years at this point, so we knew each other pretty well. But in that conversation, in that little Winnebago for an hour, we learned a lot about each other that we didn't know, things that we had never stopped to think about, like where we went to school, where we grew up, what kind of upbringing we had that led us to be the people that we are as adults. We also identified all kinds of commonalities that I think we weren't expecting, things that we shared in terms of values or hopes or outcomes or our goals, things that we had been fighting about from a policy perspective, but actually had more agreement about in terms of where we wanted to see things go. And then the third thing that happened in that conversation was, I think, what happened after. I think if you look at the way that we argued with each other before this conversation and look at how we argue with each other now, we're just as opposed as we always were, but there is a different level of understanding, I think, and respect between the two of us that comes from the things we learned in that conversation. And so that was actually a key moment also in developing the project. The idea that maybe you start there, right? Maybe you start with that conversation and then get to the place where you're going to have discussions about the things that you disagree about. I think all the time about how different things might have been between the two of us if we had started there in 2007 instead of starting out, you know, in an argument with a television camera. And so often in these sessions, that's where we'll start, is having people sit together and talk about who they are, drop the assumptions, and fill in the blanks about what they believe and why before you have those conversations.
So we do want to get back to some of this, but we also don't want you to forget about the third and fourth pillars, just briefly before we move on to
third pillar is listening. And we use that word a little differently than I think most of us do. Most of us would say we're listening when we're not talking, right? If I'm letting somebody else talk, then I'm listening, which is true in a rudimentary way. I think what we're talking about is something a little more involved. It's making an investment in the ideas that this other person is expressing, really opening not just your ears but your mind to what they're trying to communicate. I have two tests for myself about when I'm listening, to know when I'm listening. The first is when Nolan or anyone else is done talking, could I repeat back to them what they said, what they were trying to say, maybe not word for word, but in good faith, represent their side of the discussion. It's a lot harder to do than it sounds. I mean, you really do have to listen quite a bit to be able to do that. And then the second test I have for myself is whether I have questions for that person. I find that when I'm really listening to somebody, I want to know more about what they're saying. Maybe I missed something that they said. Maybe they said something I hadn't heard before. Maybe I just want to know more about what they're saying. I think this idea of an actual exchange of ideas comes from interrogation. It comes from the idea of asking more of somebody than what they have just said. It also has, I think, a very powerful rhetorical value in our language, right? The interrogative form of our language is way more welcoming and way more open-minded than the declarative form. If after Nolan is done talking, what I say to him is, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, right? Everything I say after that, he's not listening anymore, right? I've closed myself off to his ideas. But if the first thing I say is, wait a second, I heard you say this, and I don't quite understand how that fits in with what you're saying, or I haven't heard you say that before, now I'm saying, I am curious about what you think. I want to know more. I want to understand more about you. I think that's a very important part of this kind of civil exchange that we're talking about.
And the fourth pillar is sticking with it, keeping with the conversation. It's easy to have one encounter and say, well, that's it. I'm not talking to that knucklehead again. But if it's somebody you think you might find value in, sticking with the conversation, working at this. And so the keys to that, and as Steve mentioned before, you can't make it personal. Words will damage a relationship a lot more than actions will. And we've never once in all these years said, yo, you're a blank. Now, I can see him thinking that, but we've never said it. And so we've never damaged the relationship with that sort of outburst. And then, keeping things in perspective. People have these political arguments today, and you'd think they were the two people who were going to decide the outcome. That it all comes down if they can agree with each other. Keep things in perspective. We talked to a nonprofit group in Lansing a year or so ago, and there was a young woman listening and came up to us afterwards and said, and she, she's in tears. She said, I want to tell you my story. And she was newly married. Her and her husband wanted to start a family. She was reluctant to do so because he and his father had become so estranged over politics. One was Republican, one was a Democrat. They couldn't be in the same room without going at each other's throats. And this father-son relationship had evolved into hatred, really. And she said, I don't want to bring my child into a family where the people who are supposed to love it, him or her, hate each other. And it struck us when we heard that story is keep things in perspective. Politics are important, and it's important to be passionate about your politics. It's vital that you're involved and aware of policy, but don't destroy your relationships over that. Family, friends, the people who are going to be there regardless of your politics are more important than you two coming together. Accept the fact that it's okay to disagree. You can still love each other if you have nothing in common politically or in terms of policy. And we ask people to keep that in mind.
But there are stressors that make that more difficult. Economic stress, political stress, those things that tend to divide us, Ellie.
Right. I think that's where, if you think about historically, some of the stories that we try to tell here at the Holocaust Center are based around that problem. That when you're having a beer, you're having some bourbon, it's low risk. But sometimes societies are at much greater risk because of they're talking about economic stressors, things like that. If it's okay, I'd like to share two short interviews. Each one's about a minute. The first one, this is a woman, Edith Colliver, and she was talking about her life in Germany and about her gym teacher who lived near her and her parents, and his interactions with them around this newspaper, Der Strömer, which was this independent newspaper that was produced by Julius Streicher, who was vehement anti-Semite. And early, before the Nazis began to take power in 1933, was already publishing these really vituperative stories about how the Jews are the problem. And so let's watch it together. I don't think okay, here we go.
And on the top floor was our gym teacher, whom we all adored. And to him there is a story. He used to come to my parents, and with the Stürmer, that was the anti-Semitic paper, in hand. And he would be very upset, and he would talk to my parents and say, "Look what this guy is writing, all those lies." So the next year, he still came, and he says, "You know, this is the question of the big lie. You know, he keeps saying it and nobody's challenging him. There must be some truth to it." In the third year, he stayed away. I never saw him in a Nazi uniform, and I hope he didn't get one.
I think it does sort of highlight the challenge. What do you do when people are exposed to hateful ideas, and at a certain point, they just want to believe them. They are leaning in on hatred. The second story I want to share is from Marion Pritchard, who was not Jewish. She was living in Holland at the time. If we have time, I want to come back to Holland. But she describes being in school and being told to go see this film, The Eternal Jew, which was an anti-Semitic film that was made. And she talks about her experience of having seen the film. So let's see this clip.
So they started this education propaganda campaign to set the Dutch against the Jews. They made all the movie theaters show a movie called De Eeuwige Jood, The Eternal Jew. And one of our Jewish sociology teachers told us to go and see it. And we went, the Jews could still go to the movies at that point, and we looked at the movie and we sat and laughed and made smart remarks all the way through and disagreed with everything they said. But when we came out, a Gentile friend said to me, "I wish I hadn't seen that movie, because now for the first time I have a feeling of them and us." I now look at, and he pointed to the Jewish kids that were walking, a few steps away. It said it's them, and they're not us, and I don't like it.
So Marion ended up joining the resistance in Holland. She saved 150 Jews, got them false papers, kept them through the war. People can make choices even being exposed. But I think that the thing to think about is how society as a whole has influence, because we talked a lot about the interpersonal, but the challenge is there's a lot of other stuff coming at us.
Well, we didn't talk much about media and social media. Social media in particular, I think, is playing a critical role in the way we interact with each other. And actually, if you want to see a fight between me and Nolan, ask us about social media. He hates social media. He doesn't want to participate in it. He thinks it's terrible. I think it is an incredible opportunity to be able to connect with people and get information in ways that we didn't before. I admit that it's not playing the role yet that I think it will, but if you think about the tools and the customs that are growing up around social media and what they tell us about each other, right? First of all, it gives us the power to create our own narrative about anything, about ourselves, about the world around us, about the issues that we're thinking about, and to push anything that doesn't conform with that idea away from us, right? Push any fact or information that doesn't support our story away from that. It also encourages us to create social circles that are like that. Push people out. I can block you. I can mute you. I can unfriend you. I can do all of these things that say you are not part of my world. You are not part of my reality. And of course, on social media, it's not enough just to do those things, right? You got to say you did. I blocked that person. I'm never talking to them again. And everybody cheers. I mean, this is part of the culture. This is part of the cultural problem that I think we have right now. And it encourages the idea of othering. It encourages the idea of saying, these are people who are not like me, and I don't have to even acknowledge their presence. I don't have to interact with them in any way. And this tool that I have that I use all day long makes it very easy for me to do that.
And it makes the expression of hate instantaneous. Hateful thought comes in your head, and the next minute it's out there, for the world to see. And social media, I believe, and I think Steve would agree with this, is one of the forces in our modern society that profits off our division and keeping us frightened of each other, keeping us fearful, irritated, angry all the time. You look at social media, you look at some of the cable television networks, some of the online sites that really depend on people being divided. And I think we all have to watch for those, for that, and for those institutions and outlets who encourage division, encourage hate.
So what can we do in this increasingly divisive atmosphere? I turn to you, Eli.
Okay. So I would say, again, if you want to talk about a story from the Holocaust that helps people sort of understand what their possibilities are. We talk often about a policeman in the Netherlands. His name was Henk Drocht. And in 1943, he and some other, about 12 of them, policemen were ordered to gather up a bunch of Jews. And they, at that point, understood basically they were going to be taken to their deaths. And so they refused the orders. And they were arrested. These policemen were arrested for refusing orders. Drocht escaped prison, ended up being caught, convicted of refusing orders to collect Jews, and was executed. And in the letter that he wrote to his pregnant girlfriend at the day after he was sentenced, before he was put to death, he talks about the fact that he felt comfortable being able to push back because of the other 11 friends that he had. And so when you talk about what it is that gives us that inner strength, I think that it has to do with having a circle of friends who are willing to buck a trend, who are willing to say, I'm willing to lean in a way that makes me uncomfortable, but you need somebody else to lean on. And I think that here we're not necessarily talking about people who disagree with you. It could even be people who do agree with you. There was a study that was done pretty recently about, and I'm coming back to the Netherlands because it's an interesting case. There's 75% of the Jews in the Netherlands were murdered, which is a high number for Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, 90% of the Jews in those cities and countries were murdered. The person who did the study noticed that Jews who lived near dissenters, people who in the northern part of the country were Catholic in an overwhelmingly Protestant community, or in the south, that they lived near Protestants in a Catholic part of the country. It was the dissenters who helped them survive. And your chances of survival were much higher if you were literally near the church of this dissenting group, where there were people who had like-minded and looked around and saw people who disagreed with them and were able to find common beliefs amongst their own group. So there's a support system that I think allows the two of you to do what you're doing, but that each of us has to look for. I think that's the lesson that I can draw from it.
We talk a lot about acting where you have agency to try to deal with the division that we are experiencing. And what we mean by that is, it can be really frustrating to sit on social media or watch cable news and to see all these things happening that you have no control over, right? Each of us has a vote in an election, but we don't really get to decide what happens. And then whoever wins does what they're going to do, and it feels like you don't have any way to stop it or encourage it. And then you have, things like January 6th of 2021, where I think whether you were in favor of the outcome of that election or not, I think we all kind of sat there thinking, oh my goodness, how did this group of Americans get to the point where, attacking the Capitol was the way that they thought was best to express their political ideas? And in some ways, I think it's almost as if there's almost like a conspiracy to keep us feeling that way, right? To keep us feeling
It's
like
called
we
the
can't-
algorithms.
Yeah, right. The algorithms make us feel like we can't do anything. But I think in the project, one of the things we're talking about is identifying those places where you do have agency. What are those places, right? Your family. All of us have people in our family who think differently than we do, right? Who have a different set of ideas about what's going on. And in many cases, we've pulled away from those people. We've said, I can't talk to those folks. 2016, between the election and Thanksgiving, I can't remember the number of people I heard from who said, I cannot go to Thanksgiving dinner this year, right? Because my aunt, my uncle, my brother, whoever.
Aren't you glad the Lions aren't in the Super Bowl?
Right, that's right. People pulled away from their families because of the outcome of that election. That's where you have agency. You can change that relationship. Your neighborhood, your religious community, your school community, if you have one. Places where you actually know people, where you have an opportunity to build the kinds of relationships that we're talking about. That is, I think, in some ways, the antidote to the incredible incivility that is driving our culture right now. And that's not just politics. I think all kinds of parts of our society are kind of defined by this very abrasive and exclusionary approach to the world. You can change that in your world, and I think if enough of us do that, it pushes back against that cultural trend.
You can change it yourself too, and I mean, it's not easy. And Steve and I, neither one of us pretend to be Gandhi. I mean, we have sharp tongues. We get short tempers. We often say and write things we perhaps wish we hadn't later. It's not easy.
I don't.
You do too. We won't tell them why those ladies on Mackinac were so angry with you. But anyway, you've got to always be mindful whether you're modeling civility yourself or not. It's not easy. Nobody's going to be perfect at it. But in the book, we put in this little piece of advice that I'd heard years ago from somebody talking about the impulse to immediately respond and to immediately weigh in, and it goes like this. It's ask yourself, does this need to be said? Does it need to be said right now? And does it need to be said by me? And if you keep that taped on your computer screen, it save you some uncomfortable moments. Might even save your job someday.
So give us some other, we got to get to questions, but give us a few other practical tips.
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is, if you're going into a conversation, check your self-righteousness at the door. Check your smugness. And we tell a story about, I was with John Dingell one time, and he was taking call after call from environmental groups who were angry about some piece of legislation he had introduced on behalf of the auto industry. And this went on and on. Finally, hung up the phone. He put his head in his hands and he said, they think they're the only ones who talk to God. And I think we need to resist that conviction that we have that we're the only ones who have the truth and who hold the truth, and harbor some self-doubt. Don't enter a conversation with this condescending attitude that you're going to teach somebody something. Try to learn something before you start teaching. And just minding that your own, the way you project. And Steve talks often about, believe it or not, this, sort of ultra progressive has an aunt and uncle who are very conservative.
Yes.
Happens in every family.
Against all odds, I have an aunt and uncle who spent all day watching Fox News and listening to conservative radio.
And it's worth every dollar I pay for that subscription.
And then they spend all night texting and emailing everyone else in the family about what they've learned. At 3 a.m. you'll hear the phone go off, and it's them. And look, I mean, for years, I just avoided it. I was like, it's my aunt and uncle, I love them, we'll see each other at family gatherings and not talk about politics because I can't stand this. But a few years ago, I changed that. I started to say, well, look, they are my family. I should be able to have this conversation with them, not at 3 in the morning, and let's make that clear, but when we're together, why can't we talk about politics? And so, I started with some of the things that Nolan and I try, not making assumptions, asking a lot of questions, not assuming that the conversation is a competition. And we were able to make some progress. I mean, and that's the other thing, right? It's never perfect. I would love to be able to say, oh, no, we solved that. Now we're able to deal with each other all the time. There's times when it's not worth going any further with it. But it's certainly better now than it was before. And we keep working at it. We keep at it. We keep coming back to the idea that, okay, well, we should be able to do this. Let's figure out how to do it. I think that is a real key part of what we need to do right now, because the instinct, I think the overwhelming instinct is to pull away right now, to just be like, I can't deal with this. I can't deal with this other side, whatever side is the other side from you. I cannot deal with them anymore, and I don't want to. I think there's real danger in that, and we have seen in history over and over what happens when that becomes the predominant idea.
Well, let's get to some questions. Ruth.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'd like to remind you that if you would like to ask a question, you can use the QR code, or if you prefer, if you raise your hand, someone will come with paper and pen. Okay. In today's culture, civility doesn't seem to sell. Instead, arguing and controversy seem to be the business model. How much pressure have you felt to forego civility for economic gain?
That's a question for Gary.
Frankly, very little. I do think there's truth to that, and I think if you watch 24-hour news stations and those types of things, then the controversy of the moment is what drives viewership and keeps people tuned in. I think luckily in the newspaper business and online, we're less driven to that. Most of our day is spent trying to decipher between, does Politico really get $8.5 million from the federal government, or does Politico just have a lot of subscribers in the federal government, to use an example that it maybe is common. So I don't think that's a wrong assumption that lack of civility can drive traffic, and I think that's why institutions, I often say to the newsroom that the only difference between us and somebody blogging from the neighbor's basement is that we've got 150 years of credibility because we've been in the business. And I think that's looking for news organizations and getting information from organizations that you feel are trying to give you as close to the truth as they can ascertain is important, and shy away from those that you feel are just leading you to the next controversy.
And if this book sells, we're hoping civility becomes very profitable for Stephen and I.
Start a trend.
Sounds good. So on that note, someone asked, how can civil conversations take place when too often people are operating on alternative facts, truth, and out-and-out demonstrative lies? As Groucho Marx is quoted as saying, who you gotta believe, me or your lying eyes?
First question we always
It
get.
is the first question.
And we always, go back to what we said earlier, and that is, come in to the conversation by checking your self-righteousness at the door, and by not assuming you hold the ultimate truth, and that you're the only ones that talk to God. If we've learned nothing over these last few years, is what we thought was true one day is not true the next, and that's going to become increasingly the case as AI and other means of deception grow. I mean, you're going to have to be very discerning consumers of information in terms of establishing a hierarchy of credibility in your own news sources, and it's going to be on all of us to do that. But again, if you come in with that attitude that you already know everything you need to know, and your mission is to drive that into the other person, it's not going to go well. So be open.
I always add that facts do matter, and truth matters, and the danger in history and now lies in the prevailing of the lie. We know that can happen, and we know what happens when that happens, and it's not a minor issue. It's very serious. But then I also talk about what the answer is to that, right? If I say to somebody, well, that's just you have the facts wrong. You don't understand the truth. What's their reaction likely to be? Am I reaching that person? Am I likely to convince that person that they are wrong? Am I likely to be able to share the truth with that person? Probably not. A lot of it is about how we approach these things. And remember what I said about the interrogative form of our language and the welcoming that signals. I think that's really important. Where did you hear that? Mm-hmm. How do you know that? Why do you believe that that's true? It's a very different way of addressing falsehoods than to just say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. And it's hard sometimes. And look, there are lots of people who seem very wedded to very dangerous truths, and that's not a minor thing. But the question is, how do you counter that? What do you do to redirect the conversation in a place that you can shine more light on that truth?
So Ellie, this one is for you. How does a museum teach civility to different types of visitors?
Right, that's a great question. It's actually something that we're trying to build up. That's one of the reasons why we're doing the conversation today. There are different kinds of visitors, as you know better than me even. The average visitor who walks through our door is a middle schooler, right? So that's a different conversation than it would be if you have a church group or a corporate group that comes to visit. And so you have to certainly model. And I think that what we can provide in the way that I tried to do in the conversation today is to find lessons from history. Because human beings didn't get invented yesterday. Yes, social media is brand new, but we were also willing to fall for the big lie before this. How do you build up those muscles? And you can find it in history. And so at a museum here, Gary said before, as we were talking before the discussion, that the Holocaust is the greatest well-recorded crime in human history. There is a lot we can learn. And I think that's where a museum which is trusted in a community, which has this repository of facts and of storytelling that allows people to access something which also isn't 2025 news, right? It's not something that I'm currently invested in winning this argument about, right? This is something that's a little bit more removed from me. I think that's where the strength comes from.
Thank you. Okay, so many questions here. Okay, so So, Republican and Democratic leaders punish any dissenting views within their own parties. Now, you can agree or disagree with that statement. How does this affect civility among voters?
Well, I mean, it's part of the polarization, but, you know, more than anything else, it affects quality governing. I've been watching these confirmation hearings and, you know, nominees that senators clearly have, Republican senators clearly have doubts about and have questions about, grave concerns about, they vote as one. Few exceptions, but for the most part, whether it's a Democratic administration or Republican administration now, their Congress votes 100% for the administration all the time. And that's true in the legislature. You know, there was a time when, you know, and I first started covering politics, when there were liberal Republicans, there were conservative Democrats, and all manner in between. And to get a significant piece of policy passed, like the Civil Rights Act, for instance, you had to build coalitions between the parties. You had to get some from this group and some from the other group. And that's the way our process was meant to work. It was never meant to be a parliamentary process where the party votes unanimously for this or that, but it's become that way. And I think partisanship and the strength of the political leaders, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, the power they have to control their members, you hear this all the time now, will primary a senator who votes against Pete Hegseth or whoever it is. I mean, that's a very dangerous trend that we've seen escalating in recent years, because now I'll tell you what, we've been doing endorsement interviews at the News forever. I've been doing them for 25 years. Every candidate who's come in has said, we're going to go down to Washington and we're not going to march step with the party. We're going to fight for the people. Every single one of them that have come through our office has gone down to Congress and done exactly what they said they wouldn't do. Because to stand up against the party means fewer contributions, you know, an office next to the boiler in the basement, terrible committee assignments. And that hyper-partisanship, I think, is one of the main contributors to incivility in our country.
And there are some structural drivers of that hyper-partisanship as well. One of them is money, right? The way that we have married the idea of money with speech, which is very different today than it was at the founding or at any other point in our history. This idea that money and speech are equal, they are the same thing, leads to its undue influence over politics. It's not that money shouldn't have any influence over politics, but it has all of the influence over politics, and it's done in the dark, right? We can't even see who is giving money to candidates. The other part of that, of course, is partisan gerrymandering, which, because of technology, has become not an art but a science. Parties are able to draw within a tiny degree of uncertainty exactly the lines that they need to get the majorities that they want. Now, we're doing it differently here in Michigan now. In 2018, we voted to say that citizens should make those decisions instead of politicians, and you know, we're watching that democratic experiment unfold, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, but it's a
Small d.
small d Democrat. Right? You know, it's moving us in the right direction, which is to say, the line should be drawn to represent the people, not parties. But you know, this is, again, these are things that we have some agency over, right? Making your voice heard about money and the influence of money over politics, making your voice heard about us choosing our representatives instead of our representatives choosing us in the redistricting process. Those are things that do make a difference and lead us, you know, from this kind of brinkmanship kind of political thing. You know, Nolan and I tried also with the incoming class of legislators, was it last year?
2 years ago.
2 years ago. We wanted to do a civility session for them, right? Let's all get together and talk about these things and how we might talk with each other and find ways to work together. And we got really close. And then the leader of one party said, well, I don't want to do that, because if you can convince the rank and file to listen to the other side rather than to me, then that's going to make it harder to get our agenda through. So we keep trying. But.
You know, and there's the current trend we're in that to, you know, sort of keep information away from the people. Gary can talk to that. Increasingly, they're operating in the dark, so we don't know what they're talking about and what's driving their decisions and who the influence are. I mean, it's getting almost impossible to make public information public.
No, that's true.
Okay, are there any messages from Holocaust survivors that we can learn on how to be civil today?
Well, I think two of the stories we talked about were not actually the Holocaust survivors. They were the ones who stood up, the resistors, the righteous among the nations, we call them here, whose stories really can serve. Gabi Berman and I were talking to a professor at Wayne State University, a professor of communications, who said, don't put them on too high a pedestal, though. If you think of these folks as being heroes who were just well above and beyond, we were talking about whether we would talk tonight about one of them, a woman in Poland who saved 2,500 people, children, on her own, Irina Sendler. She's a hero, and you put her on a pedestal, and it's like hard to imagine yourself doing anything remotely resembling that. But there were a lot of people who just did the right thing at the right time. And they weren't altogether good people. I don't know how many of you saw The Pianist when the film was out, but at the end you have this Nazi who's got a Jew who's willing to testify that he was nice to him at that one time, right? So, God forbid, I'm not saying that, you know, people are murderers and that they're going to do the one right thing, but each of us is a complicated person. But if we recognize that we each have a choice each day about the choices that we're going to make, I mean, that's really the kinds of opportunities that we're trying to build here. Get people to say, in this one moment, I'm going to do the right thing, just this one time, right? I'm not promising myself that, you know, I'm going to get the halo and, you know, right? I'm just going to, this one time, I'm going to do the right thing. And for me, that is one, when you talk about Holocaust survivors, it tends to be those same kinds of things that inspire me, the small acts that are done by someone who, in a moment when there was very, very little they could do for anyone else. They had really had everything stripped away from them. And yet they chose to be kind to a second person in that moment when really they had literally nothing. That to me is a way of reminding me the gifts that we have and how easy it should be for us to share them.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. So people want to know what you're talking about, the Civility Project. Does it have to work on the small personal level and maybe that's where change happens? Or can it happen on a larger scale with groups, cities, countries? What's the dynamic that has to exist?
I don't know. I tend to default toward the individual. I mean, I think, again, acting where we have agency is the thing that's possible for us and is probably the most effective. But if you do that enough, if enough of us do that enough times, that does grow into, a larger scale kind of effort. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, and since we've been doing this, we've been obviously made aware of hundreds of other efforts like this across the country. There are a good number of groups, small and large, who are dedicated to increasing civility and dedicated towards civility. And they take different approaches and they have different strategies, but it all comes down to that same thing of going back to the King quote of getting to know each other and talking to each other. And I think that's the key ingredient.
But I would add that, that I think we're all leaders of something, whether they're our family or our organization or our nation. And while, yes, it has to happen on an individual basis, there are many stories of world leaders who were at odds when they weren't talking to each other, but when they got into the same room, found common ground and found common humanity. And so while yes, it's maybe in many ways an individual process, not a group process, we all have that role to play. And it can change the course of world events if people do get to know each other, do take that step towards civility in whatever organization or group they're leading.
Thank you. Thank you, Nolan, Stephen, and Ellie, for such engaging conversation, and to Gary for skillfully moderating the discussion. And thank you, audience, for your amazing questions. If you're not yet a member of the HC, I encourage you to join us. Please stop by our membership table outside the gift shop. And if you're not yet a Detroit News subscriber, please stop by their registration table right outside to support journalism and the local coverage that matters to you. You can also visit the Wayne State University Press website to pre-order your copy of the Civility book by Nolan and Stephen. Keep up with the Zeckelman Holocaust Center at holocaustcenter.org. We look forward to welcoming you again for a tour or an upcoming program. And now I invite you to join our panelists for dessert and reception in the lobby. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure, sure.
You want-